That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with the episode 4 of Best Movie Year 1987. My name is Simon Foster. I'm one half of the Best Movie Year on-air team. The other half is Mr. Dan Barrett, who joins us right now. How are you, Dan?
Simon, I don't know if I'm excited about this movie we're talking about this week. I don't know if I'm apathetic about the movie. It's somewhere between those 2 points.
Yes, the movie we're going to be discussing this week, and before we jump into that, I just want to point out what we're doing here on Best Movie Year 1987. This is a podcast in which we examine on a weekly basis the films of 1987, specifically 100 films that we'll be tackling in chronological order throughout the next couple of years, that we think maybe best represent whether 1987 is the best movie year ever or is not. Now, we've made a case with our last couple of episodes that With Nail and I is kind of borderline. We kind of think, yes, maybe that does argue that 1987 was the best movie year ever. Then we had The Kindred. It did not. And then we had The Stepfather, which put it back in the positive balance, which we loved. But this week, we may stumble a little bit in the for argument because we will be talking about a little film called Outrageous Fortune. Dan Barrett, what can you tell us about your experiences with this film?
Look, so this is a movie which, we've talked about this in the last couple of weeks in the podcast. None of these movies that we're discussing are things that I watched in 1987. Reason, right. I was 7 years old. The likelihood that I actually saw any of these movies in that time frame is pretty slim. But Outrageous Fortune, I know, was one of these movies which I did see like a couple of times as a kid. Okay, as I sat down to rewatch it this week, I didn't remember anything from the movie at all outside of that it starred Shelley Long and Bette Midler. Okay, and we'll get to that in a moment. So I definitely remembered like what the film was, but I don't really know what it was about exactly. And as I was watching the movie, I kept on seeing moments. I'm like, oh wait, in the next scene this happens, and then it happens. So like, it was definitely in the recesses of my brain. But yeah, this is not a movie that I had any sort of specific fondness for. It was just a barely watched thing I may have watched as like a 10-year-old on VHS.
Okay, so I'll tell you who did have some fondness for it. It was released on January 30, 1987 at the US box office, and it did very, very well. It climbed to US $52,864,000 at the US box office, and we should point out that in 2024 dollars, that comes to nearly $150 million in box office taking. So this one was a legit hit for the Disney people, or more precisely their Touchstone Pictures offshoot, which we'll chat about a bit more going forward. My recollections of this film, it was kind of in my periphery all the time. I never liked it. I saw it at the movies, and then I sort of lived through its home video cycle as well. I maybe watched it twice, once at the movies and once on video, but I had no great fondness for this. I always struggled with the comedic stylings of these two actresses on screen, and we'll get to why. And having given it a bit more thought.
As a partnership or both individually?
That's a good question. I always thought that Bette Midler was funny with the right material, and this is not the right material. I never warmed to Shelley Long in any of her big screen performances. I always thought she had to have a stronger support player with her or co-lead with her to make her films work. And to that, I think of Tom Hanks in The Money Pit, and whenever she tried to lead a film, it never stuck for me. But it stuck for a lot of people. Like I say, upwards of $50 million in 1987 dollars. That's a lot of bums on seats for a comedy back then. Where can those listeners who haven't seen the film watch the film before? If you want to stop the podcast and go away and have a little watch and then rejoin us. I had to rent it off Apple iTunes. In the US, you can get it for $3.99 as a rental, which is what I had to do. So there you go, Shelley. That's a check coming your way from me. It did have a 2004 DVD release here in Australia, but it was released in the 4.3 ratio. It wasn't in any pan. It was a pan and scan release, not the widescreen.
You know what?
It hasn't had it.
That doesn't surprise me entirely, Simon, because, and in a moment we're going to play the trailer, and when people see the video quality of the trailer that we're going to be sharing, like this movie just doesn't exist digitally.
No, you're exactly right. And to that point, it was one of the touchstone titles that was not released on Disney Plus, and there was a whole lot of chitter chatter when Disney Plus was released. Where are all your touchstone films? And they haven't, and most of those haven't been transferred to digital for the streaming release. So that hasn't been answered. So I had to spend $4 on this. Thanks a lot. Touchstone people. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's play this.
Simon, it could be worse. If you're in Australia, like you can access it through Apple for, what did I just say, $11.99 or Prime Video for $19.99.
Oh my God, that's incredible. All right, well, let's have a look at the trailer and come back and chat a little bit more about Outrageous Fortune.
Touchstone Pictures presents Bette Midler and Shelley Long at their most outrageous.
Rat woman.
Outrageous Fortune.
That was the single biggest crock.
Rated R. One show sneak preview this Friday night. Check newspapers.
All right, so from the trailer, you get some idea what this manic comedic is about. I'll run through the plot very quickly. Lauren, played by Shelley Long, she's all refinement and regimentation and ballet slippers. But Sandy, played by Bette Midler, is very brassy, very bossy, all stiletto heels. They meet, and it's hate at first sight. But these two opposites are shocked to discover a common bond. They share the same boyfriend, played by Peter Coyote, a handsome school teacher who mysteriously and conveniently, for him anyway, disappears. Now seems Mr. Right has wronged them, and when they decide to track the scoundrel down, they're thrown together in a cross-country pursuit for better or for worse, mostly for worse. That's the plot of this story. It's kind of a road movie / mystery thriller comedy. Back in the day, this might have been Bob Hope and Bing Crosby doing their shtick, or Cheech and Chong doing their shtick. But what we get in 1987 is Shelley Long and Bette Midler. Where do you want to take us, Dan?
Well, maybe focus on that sort of buddy comedy element of it. So this is coming in 1987. This is kind of where we're really seeing like the rise of a lot of on-air buddy partnerships like that. So there'll be a couple of films that we'll talk about later this year that sort of follow similar terrain. But I guess maybe the films to sort of start thinking about are films maybe like, say, Spies Like Us, the Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd film.
Sure.
Stakeout, which also came out in 87. So that'll be part of our run
also
through
a
later on
touchstone
today.
film. Yep.
Yep. Stir Crazy was something I was thinking about as well.
Yeah.
That's probably, there's obviously a whole bunch of Gene Wilder, Richard Pryor movies. Just think about any of those. 48 Hours, like, was from the 80s as well. So you got a bunch of those. And like, as the, decade continues on, suddenly 87, 88, 89, you just start seeing a lot of these types of movies. Real Men, which is another film that I think is on our rundown for later this year.
Onto it with Real Men. What is it with you and Real Men?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be talking about that later on.
But like, that's it. So it's definitely one of these sort of buddy comedy elements. And you've got that. The other thing that I just wanted to think about, and we'll just discuss this a little bit, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on it, is this idea that you find people talking about sort of movies of yesteryear, and they'll be like, oh, you couldn't make that again today. The woke kids wouldn't love that or whatever. But when it comes to, like, and certainly you and I, we're pretty much on the same page with this one, which is that you shouldn't necessarily judge a film by what its cultural sensitivities were of the time, because things change.
We promise not to do that on this podcast.
Yeah, and we're not going to do that. Like, there may be something where it's like, oh my God, that was actually horrendously racist. But, it's not like we're necessarily going to judge a film for being bad because of that. It's certainly of its time period. But there's a thing with comedy where comedy doesn't age the same way that dramas do. And things that are culturally funny of the moment don't really translate through. And you start watching a lot of these buddy comedies from throughout the 80s, and some of them still kind of work and some of them don't. And this is certainly one of those ones that doesn't work. Just think about like Bette Midler, like just a year afterwards, she did Big Business with Lily Tomlin. And technically there's, I guess, 4 performances going on there because both of them play twins. But what you see there is a comedy that still kind of works. There's still something about the vibe of that film which is still resonant. I don't think there's that much that's resonant here. Like, it just kind of felt very sort of old, and even the bits that kind of felt like they should be funny, and I'm sure got laughs in the cinema at the time, just doesn't play at all. I've sat there stone-faced through this entire thing because none of the comedy landed.
Yeah, look, And this is definitely in my notes to discuss. And you mentioned at the start of the show that it became kind of one of those Disney comedies or Touchstone comedies, and I'm going to explain Touchstone in a minute. But that became sort of a VHS staple for families. But it was an R-rated comedy in the US. There's a big R rating on the poster. There's jokes about rape. There's jokes about sexual favors. One of the key plot elements is about dick size. There's certainly a few F-bombs. Like I said, we are not going to discuss how certain films maybe haven't aged too well because of elements of them, but it's hard to look past how the leery truckload of Mexican workers or the Native Americans on motorbikes with bows and arrows would be embraced today. This is exactly as you point out. There's nothing that's aged very well for this film. And we're going to get to the stars in a minute. I keep saying Touchstone Films, and I want to just point out what that is. Now, Touchstone Films, it was founded in 1984 as kind of a label or an offshoot sort of studio for Disney to explore PG films. And they came out of the gates with a big hit with Splash, the Tom Hanks film, which grossed upwards of $68 million in 87. And then they had a series of really big hits, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, Adventures in Babysitting, Ruthless People. It went on to things like Good Morning Vietnam and some quality stuff like, Tin Men. So Touchstone were a major force and really sort of saved Disney at a time when their animation was floundering.
It's weird. I didn't hear you mention Big Business just then, but sure, go on, sorry.
I'm getting to it. It was a big hit. And that brings me to the star of this film, one of the two stars, Bette Midler. As far as 1987 goes, she could do no wrong. As far as Touchstone or Disney cared, she was part of the ensemble that made Down and Out in Beverly Hills a hit. Her masterpiece, and still one of the funniest films I've ever seen in a cinema, is Ruthless People, which was the film she made just before Outrageous Fortune. Then this came out and was a hit. Big Business was a hit, and a couple of years after that, Beaches came out. So she had a track record with Touchstone that was big box office, and she'd stumbled into this on-screen persona that people in the 80s absolutely adored. So of all of those films, Outrageous Fortune is by far the lesser effort, and things became a bit unstuck for her after Beaches, which was a huge hit, but then she tried to come back and do a similar movie called Stella, which died at the box office, and the wheels started to fall off for Bette Midler. But she had an incredible run over this time.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we've got the co-star here, Shelley Long, obviously best known these days for Cheers. When you watch Cheers, comedically, she is absolutely the standout on that program in the first 5 years. Like, she is just incredible. And I think Shelley Long is genuinely a pretty talented comedic performer. The problem is she is, I guess, very specific in what she brings to the screen, and has a lot of variations on a very similar character. And, your mileage is going to vary depending on how good the material is for any of these films. So her career at the time, so she was just coming off the back of Cheers. So that was a show that started in 82, and she was on it for the first 5 years. So as this film came out, would definitely have been right at the tenure as audiences were saying goodbye to her on the program. But this is kind of the start of her with a very short-lived series of successes on the big screen. So as we talked about, this film did gangbusters. It was one of the biggest films of the year. The year prior, she'd done The Money Pit with Tom Hanks. The year after this, she did, same year. I don't know if it's on our list of films to talk about. I think we may have bypassed this one. But Hello Again, which is one of those 80s films where, someone dies and comes back.
Terrible film.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to talk about it.
No, we're not.
No?
I adored Shelley Long at this point, because not only because of Cheers, but, I was of a certain age, and the Ringo Starr movie Caveman, in which she played the love interest, was such a funny movie to me back then. It's unwatchable now, but it was hilarious back then. And she was a great foil. She was the perfect foil for Henry Winkler and Michael Keaton in Night Shift, which was also a big hit back in the day. Money Pit wasn't a big hit, but it had its fans and certainly was on its way to establishing Hanks as a leading comedian.
Yeah, but also just think about that idea, though. This is mid-'80s, though. So this is where VHS is really starting to come in, and Money Pit was certainly a VHS favorite. But what I wanted just to get to briefly was that we're looking at 86 Money Pit, 87 Outrageous Fortune and Hello Again, 89 Troop Beverly Hills, And at that point, like that's when the star just completely shined. So she had like a good sort of 4-year theatrical run, but certainly as you look at her career, like it's Cheers and Nanny's are kind of just footnotes.
And then she kind of bounced back in the role that most people were dying for her to play, and that was as Carol Brady in the Brady Bunch movies, but that was in the mid-90s.
She didn't really bounce back. She was just kind of there for that. It's not like her career
she was in the ensemble,
resurgence.
Yeah, exactly. The rest of the cast is this who's who of mid-80s character actors. I've mentioned Peter Coyote, who many of us will remember as the scientist in E.T., and he has become quite famous for being the actor who almost got the Indiana Jones role. There's a great story about, and I'm diverging away from Outrageous Fortune a bit here, but Peter Coyote walked into the room to audition for Indiana Jones, tripped on a lamp cord and made this huge mess. And Steven Spielberg's on record as saying if we wanted to make Indiana Jones into a comedy, he absolutely would have cast Peter Coyote because he thought it was hilarious. You've also got in there actors like Robert Prosky, who plays this very broad Russian acting teacher. Anthony Heald, who many will recall from person who gets eaten, spoiler alert, at the end of Silence of the Lambs, as Jodie Foster's CIA boss. Walk-on parts for Krista McDonald, Robert Pastorelli, who you know and love from Murphy Brown. And for some reason...
because apparently we're allowed to mention TV now, Anthony Heald as well, obviously from Boston Public through the 2000s, was a big presence on that show, as I recall.
Of course, yes, of course. Now, for some reason in this is the cutting-edge comedian and legend of stand-up George Carlin in one of his
I don't know how he ended up in this.
Oh, mate. He would have seen Disney dollars and thought, yeah, I can get a bit of this. So he plays this sort of hippie New Mexico drugged out guy who helps the two women when they head down to the desert state. And it's just a thankless role for him. At this point of the movie, you are dying for someone like George Carlin to turn up and save the movie. He does not. He is as bad as everything else in this film.
Yeah, nothing in this film really works. Hey, look, can we just get to the pairing of Shelley Long and Bette Midler for a little bit?
Let's do that, yes.
This to me is the only thing that's actually genuinely interesting about this movie, and also kind of funny. So what you've got here is two actors who are very much sort of nearing their peak of fame. Okay, and as evidenced by the box office, like this is a pairing that audiences were very receptive to and very excited by. It's hard to imagine that looking back at this film all these years later, but certainly this was a very exciting sort of cultural moment. Who do you think was the star of this movie, Shelley Long or Bette Midler?
Well, yeah, look, I think the way the final edit ends up...
Just give me a name, because, okay, what you're about to say, the final edit, that's the question here. Okay, so let me explain where I'm getting at here. So, Shelley Long and Bette Midler, both huge stars. Who's going to be top billed depends on where you lived around the United States.
I know, this is so bizarre.
So, look, I'm going to read this directly from Wikipedia, but like it's suddenly just sort of rounded about. Okay, so I'm going to read the line here. Long received top billing in advertising west of the Mississippi River, and Midler received the honor in the east. Okay, and so that actually extends as far as the physical copies of the film, where discs that was, like movies that were shipped to retailers in the West had Shelley Long, and retailers in the East got Bette Midler.
Yeah, you're right. And it extended to the VHS release. It extended to the Laserdisc release of this film. They had to run off 2 lots of prints for the cinema and for the home video market just to help these 2 stars deal with the billing issues of the top billing issues, which I find bewildering.
Yeah. The big sort of joke of Toy Story, if you remember when that came out, was that because that had Tom Hanks, obviously a huge star, and then also Tim Allen, who was massive at the time because of Home Improvement. I think that Tom Hanks ended up making like $1 less as part of the thing. So obviously, but that got used as part of the marketing push for the movie. So I suspect that Tom Hanks was perfectly fine with it. Also, I don't think that Tom Hanks necessarily had the same ego as you find with the 2 stars here of Outrageous Fortune. Can we play a clip of Bette Midler, who was on Oprah, talking about her working relationship with Shelley Long?
Do it.
And she's very polite.
Yeah.
Hi,
You and Shelley Long were great together in Outrageous Fortune. I was wondering if you guys were going to work together again.
I don't think so.
No?
No, I don't think so.
Did you enjoy working with her?
It was pretty rough. It was rough. It was pretty rough. But she did a good job, I think. As it turned out, it was a very, very successful picture for both of us. And actually, you know, I have thought about working with her again. If the right script came along, I wouldn't mind.
Well,
but there's always you, Oprah.
yeah. I know, yeah, we had a script, but it was a bad script.
Yes.
We both thought it was a bad script, so nice idea, but bad script. Someday you never know. You never know.
You know.
Let me bring my opinion of this. What is one of the key issues and the key problems with this film? There's no comic foil in this movie. These are two very big comedic performances, each battling for laughs and battling for space on screen, which material that is just patchy at best. So it just becomes this loud, screechy, and we've called it a buddy movie, but they're not buddies. There's always conflict and tension between them, which isn't always funny.
But also, isn't that the hallmarks of a buddy comedy, where you've got two mismatched people who come together by the end?
Yeah. And there's exactly. There's a begrudging acceptance of each other towards the end, which there certainly is of this. But for the best part of this movie, they are just screaming and yelling at a pitch which was infuriating after a while. And that's the other thing as well. This film is full of really terrible people. The leads are terrible people who you wouldn't want to spend 5 minutes with. But there's also these sort of sundry collection of men in supporting roles. The cab driver is this sort of grunting caveman of a guy, and the tobacconist sort of is negotiating sexual favors to get information. The acting coach is a creep. So you're never quite sure. And none of them have any sort of comedic payoff which helps their bad elements become funny. They're just horrible, horrible people. And I think that is part of what I had, an issue with this film.
Yeah, look, none of the elements really play at all these days. Where I actually think the movie... look, there's a whole bunch of places where the movie just doesn't work for all sorts of reasons, but I kind of feel that Shelley Long is actually... Like, when you watch the first, 10 minutes of the movie, Shelley Long holds this film together pretty well. Like, she's actually kind of funny, and seeing her as this very sort of perfectionist stage actress who the rest of the people in her acting class just hates because she's really good. There's, a great... dance moment which actually had me almost laugh. There's a great moment where you see Shelley Long outside of her parents' apartment, and she's trying to get more money because she wants to go to this acting class. I think she needs $5,000 to be able to do it. And it's clear that the mother is just upset at the idea that they're going to be giving more money to their wayward daughter to go and do this, but the father just caves in. Anyway, that scene's kind of funny. You're watching that and it all sort of works, but the film kind of falls off the rails of being sort of potentially okay when Bette Midler's character comes along. And I think Bette Midler is just badly cast for this movie. She doesn't really bring anything to her. And it's weird because Bette Midler, I think, is just, particularly through the sort of mid-80s through to early 90s, she just sparkles on screen. I'm a big Bette Midler fan of this sort of time period. But, she just doesn't really seem to fit the film entirely. They don't really quite give her stuff that fits her as a on-screen presence. You speak about that idea of you speak about this idea of the big actors, and never necessarily the people of whom are necessarily the best actors, but they are people that bring a certain something to the screen. And she's certainly one of these people, and I don't think they've given her what makes Bette Midler work on screen.
This was the third sort of character like this that she'd played for Touchstone. She'd sort of reinvented herself a little bit as the housewife in Down and Out in Beverly Hills, which is sort of a riff on this. But there's a real sort of point of change in that character that made it endearing. Then she sort of really lent into it in Ruthless People, in which she plays this thoroughly horrible but utterly hilarious version of this character. So by the time Outrageous Fortune came around, she was kind of doing the same shtick. And of those three films, this is, as I mentioned, this is by far the lesser of them. So we could see how good she could be in this role. And this is a badly underwritten, badly sort of conceived character that didn't give her a whole lot to work with. What I found that this film... Sorry, go
Sorry,
on.
I feel that you're about to probably send something off in a different direction. So if I can just
Yes.
sort of hang on to this for a moment.
Yeah.
So Shelley Long in this plays a sort of very buttoned down but greedy sort of a person who's kind of only really in it for herself. Like she's very much about her craft and will stop at no relationship really until she kind of gets like that sort of fulfillment. But very down, very sort of dowdy as a person as well. I kind of feel like the person playing opposite her needs to really work against that in a really major way. But Bette Midler, her performance just seems a little bit muted and she's not really clearly defined on screen. And so I'm going to throw the question to you. The Bette Midler character, who's supposed to be a very sort of sexy, bawdy character, who's really quite the opposite of what that Shelley Long character is doing, and just sort of open and maybe sort of a bit more spiritually sort of accessible. Who do you think from the 80s could maybe sort of fill that co-star role? Because I feel that change that actor around and you actually have a really sort of different, sort of stronger dynamic.
Yeah, I agree with you. Off the top of my head, who would you put in there? I'd love to have seen Cher at her peak opposite Shelley Long in this. That might have been something good. That would have been a great sort of mid-80s bit of casting. That maybe off the top of my head, a time-appropriate, era-appropriate actress would have been Cher. Do you have any ideas?
No, like I keep on coming back to like Lily Tomlin a little bit, but I don't think she's big enough to big and broad enough to necessarily
Not big
carry
enough
it.
and probably not outwardly sexy enough like Cher would be to embrace to be. Well, that was the other thing. There was quite a graphic sex scene with Peter Coyote and Shelley Long on the chair, which I thought this is very at odds with what I'm expecting from this movie, which became a living room staple for so many people over the years. So, you mentioned the first 10 minutes of this film being okay. I kind of disagree with that. There was a lot about that all that acting class bullshit that I just found counterintuitive. She bought her way into the acting class, but we miss out on seeing Bette Midler's audition scene, which could have been hilarious. And we certainly missed out on seeing Shelley Long's. Yes, they paid their way into the class, so that kind of explains why they're being there. But I just thought there was big laughs left on the table. The other thing was when they go to the morgue and they have their big first confrontation where they realize that they've had the same boyfriend. They have it behind this sort of opaque glass window where you hear them screaming and yelling, and I did not need to hear them screaming and yelling anymore. But you missed that moment on screen where they have the realization that they've both been seeing Peter Coyote, and I thought that was a strange choice. It's directed by Arthur Hiller, who was at this stage just a journeyman Hollywood studio actor who had quite a big presence in Hollywood. He became the head of the Directors Guild, maybe one of the guilds, but he was a major player behind the scenes in Hollywood, and he directed Love Story and then Silver Streak and then just a whole lot of movies right up until 1984 Teachers. Then he had a break, and this was his first film in 3 years, and I don't think he had the punchy comedic flair that this film needed to pull off some of these moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that holds for a lot of people in this. But like the Bette Midler character, she's just kind of a bit underwritten at the beginning. Like you don't really know what her motivation is to be in that acting class. Like there's just a whole lot of just absence, I guess, happening around that character.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's a big explosion when the florist blows up, which is the setup for Peter Coyote leaving their lives and potentially dying. But was that a pretend florist? Like, was that just the shop front, or did they actually murder a florist and anyone else that might have been in there at the same time? It was something that I was like, oh my God, that's a horrible thought that he would actually take all these people with him just to sort of hide out. So that was strange. There was a whole lot of very strange, sort of nonsensical. Did any of it make you laugh? Were there moments that got a giggle out of you? Because there's two lines in there that did make me laugh.
Okay, well, first of all, it's the CIA, so obviously they just murdered whoever. Like that's it's not a concern in the slightest. Yeah. Look, I don't think there was any moments where I actually properly laughed. As I said, I think at the beginning there were definitely moments with Shelley Long's character where there were moments which kind of felt sort of comedically amusing, but didn't necessarily get an actual chuckle. And I kind of feel like I was watching it going, you know what, this actually could be something. And then by the time Bette Midler's character came in, and as I said, horribly underwritten. Like, the film just kind of falls apart entirely by then. Like, the other element, which is supposed to be the value add to the movie, just doesn't.
The moment when they return, or when they go to Bette Midler's messy apartment, and Bette Midler starts to freshen up with makeup, and Shelley Long says, "Nothing for the nose," that felt like a really like a fresh improvised line, and Bette sort of gives her a glancing look, which suggests that maybe that was off the cuff, and I thought that was very funny. I also thought that Bette Midler dressed as a shy Mexican teenage boy, and that the way she played that part was when they go to the brothel and Shelley Long is all big and takes on the character part, and Bette Midler sort of this shy Mexican boy in the background. There was a moment there where I did have a little bit of giggle at her appearance, but in every other respect, I didn't find any of their banter funny. I didn't find any of the support players bringing any things that might have worked. And it's unusual because let me just point out very quickly, and I'm sort of backtracking a little bit here to some of the creatives on the film. It's written by a lady called Leslie Dixon. It was her debut film, and she went on to be one of the biggest comedy writers of the next 10 to 15 years. She'd done a polish on Look Who's Talking Now, but then she wrote Mrs. Doubtfire. Then she did films like Freaky Friday and Hairspray, as well as dramas like The Thomas Crown Affair and Pay It Forward. So she had a serious writing career, and still to this day does, in the wake of the success of what was arguably her worst script, or maybe most overworked script in Outrageous Fortune. So it's a shame. It's a shame because these two can be very talented people, but that wasn't seen in this one.
Also, you neglected that she mentioned that she was the credited writer for Overboard, which will be part of our 100 films that we're discussing here.
That's exactly right.
Not until the very back end. I think it's like the third last film we're talking about.
It's right near the end, I know.
Yeah.
Do you have a most memorable scene from this?
It's probably just right at the beginning, which is the Shelley Long trying to beg money from the parents scene, which just struck me as I just thought that was inherently a very funny character beat for her.
Yeah,
because it's kind of, I guess what's interesting to me about that scene is that you see this character at the very beginning who's kind of like the sort of perfect drama school student, okay, and seems like she's kind of got it all together, and then you see like she's actually just a bit of a mess because she doesn't have the money to be able to do that, and her career hasn't really gone anywhere, and it's kind of all encapsulated nicely in those sort of, the scene sort of, that scene, I guess, maybe the sort of couple of beats sort of surrounding it. And it's that thing of comedy works well with contrasts. And so that was kind of like that nice sort of insight that we wouldn't get at any other point through the film.
I couldn't find a comedic moment that was the most memorable scene, just because I don't think there was any. I think the exploding florist was pretty cool. That was a big explosion and fairly well handled, like shot from inside Shelley Long's cab. So that was good. For the wrong reason, the Native Americans on the bike was just horrible, just such a bad scene.
I'm going to admit, by the time that even happened, I'd checked out mentally in this film.
It went on so long. This only went for 99 minutes, but they
it only felt like 2.5 hours.
Oh God! But they spun in the third act. They finally introduced the MacGuffin, the whole airborne toxin thing that'll kill life for miles, and that comes up at the start of the third act, and then it spins off on this whole other being chased by helicopters over the desert and climbing mountains and all this sort of thing. It just went on and on in that third act. Terrible. For me, the most valuable player, apart from maybe Peter Coyote, who was a legitimately creepy bad guy, the most valuable players in this were the stunt people. This film makes absolutely no effort to disguise the stunt people standing in for the stars, especially any time that Bette Midler's character had to run in her high heels. It's a very obvious stunt stand-in that is maybe 20 kilos lighter than the very lovely Bette Midler, but it is not the same body shape. The scene where they're hiding in the tumble dryer, which is very dangerous, kids, don't do it. But the person getting out of that tumble dryer is not Bette Midler, I can promise you that. So yes, I'm going to say the MVPs are the stand-ins for the stars in this, who put a lot of effort into the screen time. Final thoughts, Dan Barrett. Any final thoughts on this film as we move forward?
Final thoughts. Look, I mean, this certainly is not necessarily one of the standouts of 1987, but I think probably important to watch this because it contextualizes just that idea of the sorts of comedies that were big at the time. And just culturally, I think it's a bit interesting without actually being a film that holds the test of time.
Yeah. Final thoughts from me. I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now.
You know what? Final thoughts from me. I just in that I certainly saw this as a kid a whole bunch of times, but it's really clear to me now as I watch it that there's a reason I probably didn't see it more than a couple of times as a kid. Like it wasn't one of those films. Like I think about the rest of 1987 as we're going to start talking about, and think about like those sort of buddy cop types of things. Like we're going to talk about Lethal Weapon in a couple of weeks' time.
Yep.
What else is there? Oh gosh, Ishar's probably not a really great example. Just going through, just trying to find buddy cops here. Well, I mean, that's probably a good example of things that didn't work. Stakeout is probably another one. So Stakeout I watched so many times when I was a kid.
So did I. Love Stakeout.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you were a kid, Simon, when you were a kid.
When I was a kid, I was watching silent movies.
But yeah, like, you know, there's films which I did watch a lot as a kid, and this was one that I think I may have watched because I thought it should be good, and then rewatched a couple of times because I thought it should be good. But clearly, I don't think I ever watched it all the way through because while there were moments at the beginning of the movie that I remembered a lot, I did not remember anything from the back end, and even right now, I don't remember anything from the back end of this film.
Other than to put what we've said in this podcast into any sort of context, do you recommend that the good listeners seek out and watch Outrageous Fortune? I would say no.
Look, I would say if you are if you're Shelley Long curious, okay, I think it's probably interesting. Okay, if you're after actual entertainment, probably not. And if you don't like money, because I think having to pay $11.99 minimum to watch this movie is not a wise investment of your money, maybe give that a miss.
Steer clear. Which brings us to the end of this week's Best Movie Year 1987 podcast. It's been fun. Next week, we'll be looking at the art and not the artist. We'll be talking about Woody Allen's Radio Days and how it's indicative of the director at nearing his peak of 80s output. I loved Radio Days, but it's not something I've seen in a long, long time, so I'm keen to revisit it. And how we'll be handling Mr. Allen's off-screen antics, we'll discuss in a production meeting at some point through the week. But either way, we can't ignore the films of 1987, so we'll be talking about Radio Days.
Look, I know I've got a lot of talking points on Woody Allen, but whether they'll make their way into the podcast, I'm not too sure because I don't know if I want to get cancelled. But yeah, look, I'm pretty enthused about seeing it because I've never seen Radio Days, and it's got a pretty interesting cast to it. So yeah,
really does.
Keen to press play on that one. Yeah.
So that's the end of this week's... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say this has been Outrageous Fortune. You can find it around the place, but it will cost you a rental to be able to watch it. Simon, do you want to tell people what we've got coming up over the next couple of weeks on this podcast?
Oh my God, what haven't we got coming up? A little film called...
Because we're reaching the exciting point on it.
Light of Day is a film from director Paul Schrader, starring Michael J. Fox, and represented the film debut of Joan Jett, one of the big music stars of the period. We are also talking about Mannequin. We are talking about Sylvester Stallone in Over the Top. I've never seen Over the Top, so I'm very excited to be seeing that.
Yeah, I've never seen that.
Okay, so that'll be fun. And then we move forward into films like Some Kind of Wonderful and, as Dan had mentioned previously, Lethal Weapon. So a heady mix going forward of great films from the 1987. Dan Barrett, I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Look, absolutely. Folks can find us at bestmovieyear.com. You can sign up to our newsletter, which will let you know when the movies are coming out, as well as give you a few bonus extras around the place. Also find us on YouTube at the Best Movie Year. Yeah, so we're around the place. Yeah, stick around. We've got some really good, exciting films coming up. And sorry for anyone who's watched Outrageous Fortunes, keep up with this podcast.